Three young civil rights workers disappeared in Mississippi. One was just 20 years old, Andrew Goodman, a white American from New York City. He was Jewish. Another was 21, James Chaney, black American, born and raised in Meridian, Mississippi. The oldest was only 24, Michael Schwerner, a white American from New York. He was also Jewish. Their names were James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. They came together during the Civil Rights Movement to help black Americans exercise one of the most basic rights in this country, the right to vote. But on June 21, 1964, all three men disappeared near Philadelphia, Mississippi. They had been arrested. They had been placed inside a local jail. And after they were released late that night, they were never seen alive again. What investigators would eventually uncover was horrifying. Their disappearance was not simply the work of a few random criminals. Federal investigators determined that members of the Ku Klux Klan participated in a conspiracy to murder the three men, and a local deputy sheriff was among those implicated. The case became one of the most infamous crimes of the Civil Rights era. And more than 2 decades later, Hollywood would turn a heavily fictionalized version of the investigation into the movie Mississippi Burning. But today, we're not focusing on Hollywood. We're talking about the real young men behind the movie and what actually happened to them. Before we begin, this video is for historical news reporting, education, and commentary. The 1988 movie Mississippi Burning was inspired by the 1964 investigation into the murders of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, but the film contains fictional characters and dramatized events. This report focuses primarily on the documented historical record and should not be interpreted as representing every scene in the movie as fact. Who were the three men? Let's start with the young men whose deaths became known around the world. James Chaney was 21 years old. Chaney was a black Mississippi native from Meridian. He had become involved in the Civil Rights Movement and worked with the Congress of Racial Equality, commonly known as CORE. He was helping organize black communities in Mississippi at a time when doing that work could put someone's life in danger. Then there was Andrew Goodman. Goodman was only 20 years old. He was from New York and had traveled to Mississippi to participate in the 1964 Freedom Summer Campaign. And finally, there was Michael Schwerner, who was 24. Schwerner was also from New York and was deeply involved in civil rights organizing in Mississippi, alongside his wife Rita. These three men came from different backgrounds. But in the summer of 1964, they shared a common mission. They wanted to help black Mississippians register to vote and challenge racial discrimination. And that made them targets. The burning of Mount Zion Church. Before the three men disappeared, there had already been violence. Civil rights organizers had been working with members of Mount Zion Methodist Church, a black church in Neshoba County. The church was going to be used as a location connected to civil rights organizing and voter education. Members of the Ku Klux Klan attacked members of the congregation, and the church was burned. Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner traveled to Neshoba County on June 21, 1964, to investigate the church burning and speak with people in the community. But on their way back toward Meridian, something happened that would change American history. They were arrested. The three men were stopped near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price arrested them. Chaney was accused of speeding. Goodman and Schwerner were also detained. All three were taken to the Neshoba County Jail. And this part of the story is extremely important, because authorities now knew exactly where these civil rights workers were. The men were held for several hours. Then, later that night, they were released. They got back into their station wagon and started driving. But they wouldn't get far. According to the case established by federal investigators and prosecutors, members of the Ku Klux Klan had been alerted. The three men were pursued. Their vehicle was stopped. and Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner were taken to an isolated area. There, all three were murdered. They disappeared. When the men failed to return to Meridian, civil rights workers immediately became concerned. Remember the environment they were working in. This was Mississippi in 1964. Civil rights workers faced threats, intimidation, beatings, bombings, arrests, and murder. So when three workers suddenly vanished after traveling into Neshoba County, people knew something could be terribly wrong. The disappearance quickly became national news. And soon the federal government became involved. The FBI arrives. The FBI launched a massive investigation. The Bureau gave the investigation the code name MeBurn, Mississippi Burning. That's where the name later used by the movie came from. Federal agents descended on Mississippi. The search became enormous. Agents, sailors, and other personnel searched wooded areas, roads, waterways, and rural locations, looking for the missing men. Their burned station wagon was discovered. But there was still no sign of Chaney, Goodman, or Schwerner. And the investigation faced another major problem. Federal authorities weren't simply searching for three missing people. They were investigating a crime in an environment where racial segregation and white supremacy were deeply embedded in parts of the local power structure. And eventually investigators began uncovering evidence that this case went beyond the Ku Klux Klan operating outside the law. A law enforcement officer himself was implicated in the conspiracy. Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price, the same officer who had arrested the three men earlier that day, would later become one of the defendants prosecuted in connection with the conspiracy. The search uncovers something even bigger. There's another disturbing part of this history that often doesn't receive enough attention. While authorities searched Mississippi for Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner, other bodies were discovered. The national attention surrounding the disappearance exposed just how many black families had been living with violence and disappearances that never generated the same level of national response. It raised an uncomfortable question. How many black victims had disappeared in Mississippi without hundreds of people coming to search for them? The disappearance of these three young men had finally brought the eyes of the nation to Mississippi. The bodies are found. For 44 days, the families waited. Then, on August 4, 1964, investigators finally found what they had been searching for. The bodies of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were discovered buried beneath an earthen dam on a farm outside Philadelphia, Mississippi. All three had been killed. The disappearance that had captured national attention was now officially a murder investigation. And the evidence pointed toward a coordinated conspiracy. The federal government faces another problem. You might assume that once the bodies were discovered and investigators identified suspects, murder charges immediately followed. But that's not what happened. Murder was primarily prosecuted under state law. And Mississippi authorities did not immediately bring state murder prosecutions against the men believed responsible. So the federal government pursued another route. Federal prosecutors charged multiple defendants with violating the civil rights of Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner. The case ultimately reached the United States Supreme Court after a federal judge initially dismissed charges against several defendants. In United States v. Price, the Supreme Court ruled in 1966 that federal civil rights law could be used in the case. That decision allowed the federal prosecution to move forward. The 1967 Trail. In 1967, federal prosecutors finally took the case to trial. Several men were convicted of federal civil rights violations. Among those convicted was Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price. But the sentences were relatively short compared with what many people today would expect for participation in a conspiracy connected to three murders. And one man who would become particularly important decades later was Edgar Ray Killen. Killen was a preacher and Ku Klux Klan organizer. During the 1967 federal trial, The jury could not reach a unanimous verdict against him. He walked free. And for decades, there would be no state murder conviction in the case. Decades pass. Think about that. James Chaney was 21. Andrew Goodman was 20. Michael Schwerner was 24. They were murdered in 1964. Their bodies were buried beneath a dam. Federal authorities established a conspiracy. Several people were convicted of civil rights offenses. But decades passed without a state homicide conviction. Then the case was reopened. And more than 40 years after the murders, Edgar Ray Killen was finally prosecuted by the state of Mississippi. Edgar Ray Killen convicted. In June 2005, almost exactly 41 years after the killings, a Mississippi jury convicted Killen of 3 counts of manslaughter. He was not convicted of murder. But for the first time, Mississippi obtained a state homicide conviction connected to the deaths of Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Killen was sentenced to 60 years in prison. He died in prison in 2018. It took more than 4 decades for that conviction to happen. Then came Mississippi Burning. In 1988, Hollywood released Mississippi Burning. The movie starred Gene Hackman and Willem Dafoe as FBI agents investigating the disappearance of 3 civil rights workers. The film became famous and introduced millions of people to a story inspired by the case. But there's something viewers should understand. The movie is not a documentary. Major characters were fictionalized. Events were changed or invented for dramatic purposes. And the film was criticized for putting fictional white FBI agents at the center of a story that originated with the courage and sacrifice of civil rights workers and black communities in Mississippi. The real story wasn't simply about heroic FBI agents arriving and defeating racism. The FBI investigation was important. Federal intervention was critical to uncovering the conspiracy and bringing federal charges. But the civil rights movement had been fighting this system long before federal agents arrived. People like James Chaney were already risking their lives on the ground. Remember James Chaney. And this is where I want to spend a moment specifically talking about James Chaney. Because when people hear Mississippi Burning, they often remember the movie. They remember Gene Hackman. They remember Willem Dafoe. They remember the FBI investigation. But we should remember James Chaney. He was only 21 years old. This was his home state. He understood the dangers black Mississippians faced. And yet he continued working for change. Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner also knowingly entered an extremely dangerous environment because they believed black Americans deserved equal rights. These weren't fictional movie characters. They were real young men. They had mothers. They had families. They had futures. And those futures were taken from them. Why this case mattered? The murders of Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner became one of the defining tragedies of Freedom Summer. Their deaths drew international attention to the violent resistance faced by people attempting to register black voters in Mississippi. But their story also reveals something deeper. When local systems fail to protect citizens, and when people inside those systems participate in wrongdoing, outside intervention can become essential. In this case, federal investigators helped uncover a conspiracy that involved not only members of the Ku Klux Klan, but a local law enforcement officer. Federal prosecutors then used civil rights laws to pursue accountability when state murder prosecutions did not come. But justice was incomplete. Some defendants were convicted. Others were not. And decades passed before Mississippi secured its first homicide conviction connected to the murders. So the next time you hear the words Mississippi Burning, don't just think about the movie. Remember the names behind it. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, 21, 20, 24. three young civil rights workers who traveled through Mississippi trying to help Black Americans exercise their constitutional rights. They were arrested, released into the night, hunted down, murdered, and buried beneath an earthen dam. Their disappearance brought federal investigators into Mississippi and exposed a conspiracy involving the Ku Klux Klan and local law enforcement. But their story belongs to something much bigger than an FBI investigation or a Hollywood movie. It belongs to the history of the civil rights movement and to the people who were willing to risk everything to challenge a system they knew was dangerous. More than 60 years later, their names deserve to be remembered. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner. May we never forget them. For more Black history breaking news and stories that deserve to be remembered, follow Black Community News. And tell me in the comments, did you know that the movie Mississippi Burning was based on the real murders of these three young civil rights workers?